Let's go to the astronomical sciences and look at just a few ideas there. Before NASA sent equipment to the moon, there was a real concern on their part that anything that went to the moon was going to sink into a sea of dust. And the reason they thought there was a sea of dust in the moon is very simple. You see, dust is falling onto the Earth from outer space. Our gravitational field is just sucking it up like a giant vacuum cleaner. The rate at which this dust was falling into the Earth was measured back in the early 1960s by satellites and other sophisticated techniques. Knowing how fast the dust is falling onto the Earth, they could infer how fast it's falling onto the moon. The moon has just about 1/6 the gravitational field of the Earth. And if you let it fall on the moon for 4.6 billion years, the assumed age of the moon, you're going to end up with a sea of dust on the moon, at least 50 feet thick and possibly several miles thick. Now, you've all seen the evidence how much dust was really on that moon. Well, doesn't look like much, does it? You can see some footprints here and there. Here's some scuff marks. Why is there so little dust on that moon? Look here. You see the landing pad on the lunar lander? Why do you suppose they made it so big and fat? Isn't it obvious? They were trying to spread the load out, keep it from sinking in, make it like a snowshoe. Why do you suppose they made the leg on that lunar lander so long? They actually thought that thing could sink in. I've talked with 3 of the astronauts that have walked on the moon. And each time our discussion's gotten around to the question, well, how much dust did you really see up there? And their answers were all about the same. Not much dust. Why was there so little dust on the moon? There could be many explanations, but the simplest explanation, the explanation that fits all the available evidence, is that moon has not been there for 4.6 billion years. The moon looks very, very young, like perhaps less than 10,000 years. Now get this. When the astronauts brought the rocks and dust back from the moon and scientists analyzed it, they found a surprising thing. Very few people know this. They could tell that only 1/50th of this dust came from outer space. You see, when these dust particles fall from outer space on either the moon or the Earth, they're called micrometeorites. As children, we used to call them falling stars, didn't we? But they're micrometeorites, and as these micrometeorites come slamming into the moon's surface, they are not slowed down by an atmosphere the way they are here on Earth, because the moon has no atmosphere. So these micrometeorites come crashing into the moon's surface about 7 times the speed of a bullet, and they kick up and pulverize a cloud of lunar material that is 50 times more massive on the average than the bullet itself. So consequently, of this 1-inch thick layer of dust that you're looking at here, only 1/50th of an inch came from outer space. Now, I have redone all the calculations on this, taking the most recent data, some of it made on the moon itself. If that moon has been sitting out there for 4.6 billion years, the most logical thing to expect is that there should have been accumulated a layer of dust that's 1/2 mile thick. Now, why is this an interesting question? It turns out that most scientific dating techniques point to a young Earth, a young solar system, and a young universe. You see, evolutionists, any evolutionist that really understands this subject will admit to you that if this Earth is young, if this Earth isn't at least hundreds of millions of years old, then evolution's dead. You see, evolution requires vast periods of time. If that time's not there, then the game's up. As I say, over the last 130 years, the assumed age of this Earth has been doubling at the rate of once every 20 years. In fact, since 1900, the age of this Earth has multiplied by 100. You see, there have been 6 or 8 reassessments of the age of the Earth. Each time it gets older and older and older. Well, you say, Walt, why is that? Very frankly, I don't know. But I can give you a pretty good opinion. I believe that as evolutionists have increasingly realized how complex life is, They have realized that they need more time for that newly discovered complexity to evolve. And so they'll look for a dating technique that will give them that time they need, and they'll forget the vast majority of the scientific dating techniques that point to a young Earth. You see, in Darwin's day, a living cell was thought to be about as simple as a ping pong ball. Now, we today know that that living cell is almost a complex universe in itself. Later, better microscopes were developed, and you could look through them and see how complex just the leaf structure is, the cell structure in a leaf. More time is needed. Then we start to learn about computers, start to build them, and we realize what must be going on in our minds. More time is needed. And now we see these 4,000 books stacked in front of us. Books of coded information. Now get that, coded information. That genetic code is really a code. And as you know, codes require intelligence. Well, we're now at a point where I don't care if you pack this universe with organic soup and let it sit there for billions and billions of years. You're not even going to form the first bacteria. Furthermore, that brain of an ape is never going to evolve into the mind of man. We are just too incredibly complex. But as a result of this increasing search for more and more time, you and I have grown up in a society, as well as our children, believing instinctively that things are billions of years old. Well, I'm here to say that the vast majority of the scientific dating techniques point to a young Earth, a young universe, a young solar system. People just have not heard all of the evidence for that. And in that seminar notebook, I've listed 20 other categories of evidence that speak very clearly of a young Earth, solar system, and universe. Let me give you one more of that list. The moon is moving away from the Earth. The rate at which it's moving away has been measured for over 100 years. We know why it's moving away. It has to do with the tides that the moon creates on the Earth and a law of physics called the conservation of angular momentum. The trouble is that if you were to bring this moon in as close to the Earth as possible, it would move to its present position in billions of years less time than the assumed age of the moon or the Earth-Moon system. I have simulated on a computer the many, many factors that are involved in this process, and there is no way that even making the most favorable assumptions for trying to make the moon look old, there is no way the moon can be billions of years old. There have been 2 international conferences held to try to resolve this problem in Hamburg, Germany. And even though that problem still remains, students are never told about this evidence for a young moon and young Earth. Now, you can believe in an old Earth if you want. That's your choice. But shouldn't we, in all fairness to our students, acquaint them with the evidences for a young Earth? In other words, why not teach all the science? Let's go to the earth sciences for a few minutes. What you're looking at over here is the side of a cliff in France. This is an artist's sketch. This is the side of the cliff. Here's the top of the cliff. These things are trees, fossilized trees. Notice these lines that cut across here that separate the different strata. And to get a feel for the scale of this, down here in the bottom are 3 people. So I think you can see those are pretty big trees, right? Now, why don't we ask some very basic questions about what you're looking at there? For example, how do you suppose those trees got there? Any ideas? I think there are only 2 choices, really. Either those trees grew up through the sediments, or else the sediments came down over the trees. If anybody has a third choice, I'd be happy to entertain it. We can kick it around a little bit. I'd like each of you to answer that question by just raising your hand. How many of you believe that these trees grew up through the sediments? Raise your hand, please. Okay, thank you. Don't be bashful. Raise your hand if you think the sediments came down over the trees. Okay. Raise your hand if the person sitting in front of you did not vote. And I saw a lot of you that way. Okay, you got to vote, okay? Let's reason that one through. What does it take for a tree to grow? What's the first requirement? Sunlight, sure. Would those trees have had sunlight down under here? And let's suppose that somehow they could have grown, even without sunlight. Wouldn't you expect as they push their way up through the sediments that they would distort and upwarp those sediments? And those sediments haven't been distorted and upwarped. The lines that separate these different strata go straight into the edge of those trees. I think every one of you will agree with me that those trees look as if they have been buried. Now, here is the interesting question. Everybody's got to vote now, remember? Okay. Do you think those trees were buried slowly at the rate we see things being buried today? Or do you think those trees were buried rapidly? Now, by slowly, let's think in terms of maybe an inch being laid down every 1,000 years, maybe at most a foot. And by rapidly, let's think in terms of maybe a foot being laid down every hour, maybe every day, something along that order. Now, when you vote, don't be concerned about what your neighbor's voting, or don't be concerned if you differ with me, because you could be right and everyone else could be wrong, because none of us were there to observe it, right? But let's just take a stab at this. And very frankly, it took me many months of pondering this question before I became comfortable with my answer. But I know people in here are just very intelligent. You look so alert, and so I think 10 or 15 seconds will be just plenty of time for all of you, okay? Raise your hand if you think those sediments were laid down slowly, at the rate we see things being buried today, maybe a foot every 1,000 years. Raise your hand, please. A lot of people in the back think, okay, good. Raise your hand if you think those sediments were laid down rapidly, like maybe a foot every day, every hour, something like that. Okay, let's reason that one through. Let's suppose, just suppose, those trees were buried slowly. 1,000 years pass and we've laid down at most 1 foot. What is going to happen to the rest of those poor trees? What's going to happen? A couple of people out there are saying they would rot. Yeah, those trees would have decayed in 1,000 years, certainly. And these trees have obviously not decayed. In fact, the details at the tops of those fossils are just as vivid as at the bottom. Now, there are a lot of things I'm not telling you about these trees, very interesting things. For example, some of these trees are upside down. The roots are at the top. And that might give you a little indication of what happened to get them there. Some of these trees don't have a circular cross-section. They are squished, again implying that they were buried rapidly in sediments, maybe after being water-soaked. Some of these trees traverse layers of limestone. In one case, 12 layers of limestone. Now, limestone, as far as we know, can only be laid down through water. So that might give you some clues as to how they got there. This is not an isolated phenomenon. Here is a photograph of one of these formations in Germany. Here you can see the fossil. You can see the lines that cut across. This is a scale. This is 1 meter in length, about 3 feet. These things are called polystrate fossils. A polystrate fossil is any fossil that cuts across 2 or more strata. You see, the word poly means many, the word straight means strata. So a polystrate fossil is any fossil that cuts across 2 or more strata. And it doesn't have to be a tree, it can be almost anything. But anytime you see a polystrate fossil, you've got to conclude that at least there, they were buried and buried rapidly. Now, as I say, this is not an isolated phenomenon. These types of formations are found in the United States in several places. They're found, many of them, in Nova Scotia, throughout Europe. If we could spend the next 4 or 5 hours in here just talking about the 30 or 40 evidences in that seminar notebook that deal with the earth and tell us something about our ancient past, I am absolutely convinced that almost everyone here would walk out firmly convinced that the earth has experienced a cataclysmic, worldwide flood